when we think of terrorist groups like ISIS, assault rifles and bombs probably come to mind. But one of their primary weapons is something we all use every day: social media. They use it to recruit, make threats, take credit for attacks, and sometimes even hack into government accounts. It's also the easiest and most cost effective way for terrorists to spread their message. American companies like Twitter and Facebook have become propaganda megaphones for foreign terrorist organizations. They use social media to conduct Q&A sessions, and on Instagram there's even a Cats of Jihad account where extremists post pictures of kittens with assault rifles. Joining us now to talk about ISIL's online presence is Gregg Roman. He's a director of the Middle East Forum. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Your organization is dedicated to defining American interests in the Middle East and protecting the U.S. from Islamist threats. If social media is being used to help radicalize thousands of people and raise millions of dollars, why aren't American companies or the government just shutting these terrorist social media accounts down?
Well, this is really the big debate of security versus privacy. Americans, going back to the time of our country's inception, have been very careful in guarding their right to be able to free from government interference. But on the other hand, we've seen that the government has been charged with protecting us through wars and conflict and internecine rebellion. And through the 200 plus years that our country has been around, we've had to be able to strike a balance. During times of peace, protecting privacy, and during times of war, being able to sacrifice that a little bit in order to make sure that the security of the country comes first.
Would anything violate terrorist free speech rights? Does the Constitution even apply to terrorists?
Even if they're American citizens during a time of war, that can be suspended, as we saw during the Civil War with the occupation of Baltimore, as we saw during World War II with the different measures that President Roosevelt took against domestic threats. But I think that this question of rights is one in which, when an individual commits an act which either subjugates himself to increased interference from U.S. government action, or on the other hand, the ability for the American government to go in and to take advantage of that. It's just like what happens in a civil law enforcement action. When we have someone break the law, there's consequences to that. And when we think someone's breaking the law, the government has measures at its ability to be able to see if there's actually been a threat taken against an individual, property, or in this case, U.S. national security.
And some might argue, maybe we need social media to track these terrorist groups. Do terrorists' use of social media provide intelligence that maybe we wouldn't otherwise be able to acquire?
Very much so. It's called open source intelligence. This is something when you have the CIA and the NSA and the FBI scouring social media sites for tidbits of information linking towards tracking down jihadists or towards a larger plot of an attack against the United States or her allies. But there's a very fine line between propaganda, which is promulgating the message of ISIS and other terror groups trying to recruit within the digital domain, encouraging individuals to commit hijra, which is the return of Muslims to their land, whether it be in Iraq and Syria or other areas throughout the Middle East. And on the other hand, communicating plots like took place in the Brussels and Paris attacks, being able to monitor what's going on up until the point that the authorities have enough information to be able to interdict any operations that are being planned against Western targets.
Since the middle of 2015, Twitter said that it suspended about 125,000 accounts. Many of those supported ISIS. Do you think ISIS would exist if social media did not?
I think it might exist at a lesser scale, but the ability for ISIS to go beyond the traditional terror communication waves like radio, video, even viral activity that was taking place on websites, not being communicated across social media, has really shown a new terror cyber domain. I mean, Twitter may be proud of the fact that it was able to shut down 125,000 accounts, but I'm sure that there were 125,000 more accounts that were set up to replace those. What we really have to look at when it comes to social media companies is their responsibility, not just to close accounts after they've been set up, but to be able to enact algorithms that look for specific IP addresses, that look for virtual private networks, and that look for certain keywords and communications that are having them act proactively instead of reactively. Because once an account has already been set up, they can communicate message to followers, and even in between the time that it's set up and it's closed down, that's too much time to be able to have the influence groups like ISIS present on the internet.
So you think that they should have a responsibility to track them?
I do. There's a legal responsibility that Twitter claims under the Digital Communications Act, or rather the Decency Communications Decency Act that was passed in 1996, to be able to have Twitter have a sort of sovereign immunity for third-party content that's placed on its networks. Insofar as telephone and other data companies have the responsibility to communicate and cooperate with the government when a warrant is served, I think that Twitter has a responsibility not just to respond to federal law enforcement inquiries, but to work hand in hand with even a third party from perhaps the judicial branch to be able to cooperate in shutting down these networks. It shouldn't just be because they feel like they have an obligation. I think they don't just have a moral one, but also a legal one to cooperate with law enforcement.
You mentioned a few different forms of media, and long before social media, there was just plain old media. Bin Laden relied on a media van where he tuned into the news to hear about the 9/11 attacks and sort of revel in the fact that he was able to capture the entire planet's attention. Do you think terrorists are sort of innately obsessed with attention?
I think that they rely on the attention that the West gives them in order to be able to draw in recruits, in order to be able to finance their operations, and in order to be able to spread their messages and their propaganda. But insofar as much as the terrorists are able to use media to their advantage, it should be incumbent upon Western governments to use the same tools that the terrorists are using to be able to promote our Western messages. And we have short sightedly failed at using the opportunities and the technology available to us as much as the terrorists have been able to themselves. So we're really behind in that part of the battle.
And, we mentioned Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, but what are some other tools, social media tools, that these terrorists are using?
So the way that traditional messaging software worked is much like the way that you send a letter to another individual somewhere else in the United States. You put it in a mailbox, it goes to a mail post box office, it gets processed, and then it gets delivered. The way in which terrorists and Islamist groups writ large have been able to take advantage of modern technology is through what's called peer-to-peer communications. The message no longer has to go through a server, which law enforcement used to be able to use to pick up on terror communications. And we see companies now encrypting their communications and their technology to allow for even military grade cyber technology. So, as different applications like Kik, WhatsApp, Snapchat, even, and Telegram have been used, we see the owners of these companies saying that privacy lasts forever, conflict is limited. But I would argue to the founders of these companies that as long as our security is threatened, the ability to develop and to innovate within these technological spaces is incumbent upon the government protecting us.
What's the age, you think, of the average age of somebody who's using these sort of apps?
Uh, Studies show that it's anywhere between 18 and 23. And
Okay.
even individuals as young as 12 and 13 years old in the UK and France have been recruited to be able to show up in Turkey and then to cross the border into Syria only because they were contacted by an ISIS recruiter on Twitter or on Instagram.
Yeah, I think the average age of foreign fighters who travel to join ISIS is early 20s. So social media certainly plays a key role in recruitment. It's a dangerous combination. Gregg Roman, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.